how the AMR 22 went from last, and I mean last, to somewhere in the midfield. So when the season started, Aston Martin had big aspirations. We thought that Aston Martin was going to come out running. Now, obviously, we know they are doing a long-term plan, so I wasn't. But most people weren't expecting for them to come out running towards Red Bull and Mercedes, but maybe giving Alpine and McLaren a good fight for P4, trying to pick at P3. Maybe they could have had a podium or something. We were thinking big time since we saw what they did with Racing Point and how bad of a year 2021 really was. Now, what did they do? And I fully believe in this. They were the worst car at the beginning of the year. Now, I mean, sure, you can argue maybe Williams was worse, but I think they were genuinely worse than that Williams car. At least that Williams car has straight line speed and was able to make some overtaking. The Aston Martin, the A version, specifically for the AMR 2022, had nothing. It had no actual good benefits to it other than it had a little bit of downforce and it was good on its tires. But the car kept that throughout the whole entire year because it was mechanically the same car, even when they switched the whole entire concept. But the start just wasn't bad. They were a car that maybe Monaco was pretty suited to it. Any real medium to slow speed corners was good for the AMR car. And that consisted throughout the whole entire year. And that's why we didn't see them in Monza compete whatsoever, or in Mexico. They were bad there too. So anywhere with a super long straight, they weren't good. But what really dug them out of the hole? What was the thing that brought them up? Let's start from the beginning of the year. Bahrain, Saudi. First of all, Vettel did not compete in Bahrain or Saudi Arabia. Why was that? He had COVID. So we had Nico Hülkenberg take over for the beginning of the year for the first two races with Lance Stroll. And what does he do in Bahrain? He out-qualifies Stroll. I mean, okay, whatever. Stroll is a terrible qualifier, and it's more about Stroll than really Nico out-qualifying him. It's not like Nico really did whatever he did with the car. But yes, that did happen. And what happened? 0 points from each. Even on a safety car that probably should have benefited them by the end, still didn't help out the team that was so slow. They missed out on Q2 by, I can't remember the exact number, it was about a 10th. It wasn't too far off, because who didn't make it to Q2? Alex Albon. One of their competitors. I guess you can call that a competition between who's the worse car. But yes, Albon was able to make it. But they did qualify in Q2 in Saudi Arabia by the slightest of luck because Hamilton was so slow and the Mercedes and screwed up the setup completely. He did qualify in Q2, and sure, now you got it like a neck and neck. Both made it to Q2 for the first and the second race. Third race comes along. Sebastian Vettel's back. Has probably one of the worst races I've ever seen Vettel have, but to be fair, he wasn't able to actually compete into a Grand Prix or qualifying or any of that sort, so there wasn't much expectation for Vettel coming into this. But it was a tragic weekend, and guess who scored? Alex Albon, who, for the most part, was in about that P6, P7 range, actually on pace with the McLarens. Yeah, you heard me right. The Williams was on pace with the McLarens in the third race of the season. Where was the AMR? I mean, if you remember correctly, Lance was swerving like crazy to try and defend, what was it, a P10 that he could barely hold on to? He got P12 at the end or something of that sort, but had a 5-second penalty, so fell down even tragically more. The car was just nowhere. There was nowhere that they could really get with the car. A funny thing that I thought when I first saw the car, and I saw every other car how it was made, I thought it was going to be good when I first saw it. But the theory that I had, and I don't know, look at the car and you tell me. So you know that the car that they showed, the concept car for the 2022 cars and what people were to go off of with the regulation change. If you look at the side pods, they almost look identical to the AMR except they added something. To me, it looked like they took what F1 literally put out and kind of just tried making the best concept out of the car that was out on display. If you're understanding what I'm saying, it's like they took the regulation change so serious and didn't go out of the ordinary till Barcelona, obviously. Here's the next big race for AMR as a team. So they're scoreless, they're 10th. Nothing is going right. Imola comes along. Some weather comes along to where they can actually kind of perform their car in a race that I would arguably say is probably a strong race for them to compete in anyways, because it was Imola and there were a lot of slow speed corners and medium speed corners, so they could definitely compete there and actually prove that there is some potential in this car. Now, this was definitely a race that Williams was not going to be good in, but in qualifying, Albon had his brake explode, so he was nowhere to get. And by the way, if you see, I'm not mentioning Nicholas Latifi because he's pretty much irrelevant, and he was 20th every single race, with the exception of maybe a couple. Yeah, Silverstone, he got 10th. Somehow, I don't know how he did it, but somehow he did it. Sebastian Vettel actually qualified P8, got to Q3. Lance got into Q2, would have gotten into Q3 if it wasn't for a mess up on the lap. He messed up in the very last second, and that's what cost him. But guess what? In the race, well, in the sprint race, they fell back completely. And if you watch the race, they're getting outpaced by literally everybody behind them by miles. It's actually insane watching Vettel kind of just drop back and have no chance of going. They don't overtake. I think the only AMRA overtake that there was when Pierre Gasly and Lando hit each other. He passed them and he overtook Latifi one time. He went on a big dive bomb on, it was either Mick or K-Mag, and that was a beauty. That was all in Miami. But in Imola, they scored, got themselves up on the board, in 8th place and a 10th for 5 points to put themselves in P9. Now, some stuff was changing, their luck was changing. Miami was good. Lance ended up actually scoring a point, believe it or not, in that car, while Sebastian Vettel actually was going to get 8th, but got hit by his best buddy Mick. Now, what was changed in the car in Miami? Why did the car seem a little bit better in Miami, even though there were the straights? There were a couple of upgrades that they did, but the biggest thing that they talked about when the car was actually there was a complaint from both Seb and Lance that the car had zero balance whatsoever. It was nowhere to be found, and they felt like they were sliding on ice the whole entire time while driving the car. Well, in Imola and both Miami, but Miami being the big one, they finally changed the balance on the car, and they were able to actually put the balance on the car correctly towards that weight and what they had in that car at that time. So the car was decent in Miami. Both the drivers were good. They started from the pit lane. Keep that in mind. They started from the pit lane. But guess what? What was the biggest strong suit that I said on the AMR? The tires. They used the tires to their full potential. They did exactly what they needed to do, and that's how they ended up getting those positions to actually be able to score. It probably would have been a double point scoring finish if K-Mag wasn't trying to kill Lance for half the race, and Sebastian Vettel was actually able to not get slammed by Mick Schumacher on a spot where you can overtake, but you have to be careful. So, big change happens. We go to Barcelona, and we add this notorious Green Bull side pod. So when the Green Bull side pods were added, everybody's like, wow, they copied Red Bull, they're about to be seconds, they're about to be blowing everybody out the water, they are going to be the fastest car. No, they didn't do any of that. They didn't copy Red Bull, they went with their own design. It was in their wind tunnel for a long period of time. They had 2 designs that they were doing. They gave up on the first one. That's why the car ended up becoming so shite in the beginning. And this is what ended up coming out of it. But guess what? They were still trash, because the philosophy of the car is still the same. Yeah, maybe they gained a little bit of aero time, but so is everybody else. Everybody else is gaining some aero time in the beginning of the year. They were still heavy, maybe a little less, but the body was finally changed, and now there's more to go off of this body, so they can make different changes into the car. That's exactly what happened. They finally ended up getting a track, Monaco being the first track, where they could use the advantage of the car. The perfect advantage they had for this car was that in both qualifying and in the race, they can stick to those slow speed corners and medium speed, but I don't even think there's much medium speed around Monaco. You do have that one near the swimming pool, but that's it. Everything else is a slow speed corner, so they were able to actually extract good performance out of that car. Specifically Vettel. Lance was screwed from the bottom and did a screw up in the last sector, and that's what cost him the lap. Vettel qualified P9, finished P10 due to Ocon having a 5-second penalty, but still, the car was lost, balance was lost. They totally changed up the car, so it's practically driving a new car. It wasn't easy for them to actually be able to make it, and it gave them a hard time, honestly. After Monaco, we end up getting Baku, and Baku was a race that, wow, when we saw this team here, we were like, wow, they're phenomenal. But guess what? Vettel made the difference here, and qualified himself again into P9 because Vettel's favorite position is P9 to qualify into apparently this year. He gets into P9, sticks himself in a crazy position for that AMR at that time, finishes P6. Arguably could have been P5 if it wasn't for the screw up on the lockup that he had because Ocon is a dirty bastard and that's what happens. But long story short, he did great in the race. Lance retired, but Lance was nowhere to be seen. And why is that? Because he was at the back of the grid and the car can't overtake. I want to keep that in mind. It can't really overtake. Vettel had the optimal setup there. He even said in an interview, if I find it, I'll pop it up. If not, the quote was something along the lines of that he took the most that he could do with the car and went for a very aggressive setup, and that's how he ended up actually being able to drive the car properly. But what Baku did have was slow speed corners and medium speed corners on the whole right side of the track. They had that huge straight, which was to their disadvantage, but everything else was to their advantage when it came to that. Now, as the races go on, we get a common problem with the AMR. The AMR starts putting itself in that what I like to call Q1 Permanento. Q1 Permanento for Aston Martin was a regular, and it seemed like what they had in the beginning of the year ended up becoming just as bad in the middle of the year. And they were hitting Q1 for, I would say, about 3/4 of the season until a couple of changes came. Let's talk about those changes. What was specific to these changes was Hungary came along and they added those, whatever, they're illegal now for next year, but they're the little things in the rear wing that ended up kind of looking like what we had in 2021, but was banned for the regulations in 2022. They found a loophole around it. Guess who found that loophole? Dan Fallows. And everything from now on, might I add, was upgrades added by Dan Fallows. Before this, Dan Fallows was not participating in how the car was going whatsoever. He just came into the team, he was on gardening leave, and he wasn't working on the car that was in. This AMR 22 had nothing to do with Dan Fallows, and it was made by the performance engineer that they have currently, and who's now working with Dan Fallows, but still was the main guy at that time, not anymore. So this innovation was partially to do with Dan Fallows. It was the whole team, but I'm going to say that Dan Fallows is the one that ends up actually adding these upgrades to make the car be better. Hungary, they score. France is the next race that they have a upgrade for. And what do they do in France? France was going to be the track that they thought they would be abysmal at. There was no way that they were going to perform good here. It's high speed corners, medium speed corners. It's exactly what the AMR struggles at. But what did they do? They brought an upgrade, yet again by Dan Fallows, another floor upgrade that actually helped them. Vettel got into Q2 after a long period of just Q1 straight on. Got into Q2, performed well with the car. Arguably, both of them could have been in points if it wasn't for a kind of weird team order, and Lance ended up actually having the point at the end on that weird kind of parking on the exit type thing. Lance was good in that race though too, but so was Vettel. And it really was a good performance by them, and it showed that the car was moving levels. Now, next upgrade we go to, another floor change. They ended up going to Singapore, which was a track that we knew they would be strong at. This is a track that AMR was supposed to show itself off. Medium to slow speed corners, that's exactly what they did. They could have been even better if it wasn't for bad luck and actually Daniel Ricciardo being lucky on a pit stop and passing both Lance and Vettel. That could have been an easy 5-6 finish for them, and that actually would have put them ahead by the end of the year. Upgrade again brought by Dan Fallows himself on the floor. They upgraded the floor. It gave them what I would say kind of that perfect balance on the car where the car was actually able to perform. And now why I'm talking about that this actually gave them the perfect balance was they actually looked somewhat competitive in Mexico in comparison to Monza. If you remember in Monza what they had that kind of like rigid, weird rear wing that everybody's like, wow, this innovation looks so cool. And I did hear that Dan Fallows actually helped on that as well, but the car was so behind that there really wasn't much that they could do for that race. Their straight line speed is just terrible, and there was actually F2 cars that were passing them on top speed, which is just insanity that an F1 car can be behind than an F2 car. But that's Aston Martin for you, you know? Screwing up the good things. Whatever. Singapore upgrade comes. They fix the floor even more. It's their last floor upgrade that they actually bring for the year. As they bring that Singapore upgrade, we get performances like Coda. We get performances like Brazil. We get performances like Abu Dhabi, Japan. Those 4 races was really what fixed them and put them into that midfield position. They finished 7th, but tied with 6th, and should have actually had it. If Lance didn't have a couple screw-ups, they would have been 6th. Lance knows that himself. The Aston Martin team knows that itself. But this is the team that brought itself from being the worst 2.5 seconds down from that Red Bull to being about a second, fighting easily with the Alpines and McLarens, and probably beating them in a couple of races if it wasn't for weird strategy or bad luck. They were very successful in upgrading this car, and I would say, other than Mercedes, because Mercedes seems very close to that standard, they were the team that upgraded itself the most from the beginning of the year. And they really brought their A game to actually step themselves up and get themselves ready for 2023. Now, what do you guys think of the AMR 22? Obviously, it's not a car that's great, but it is a car that improved heavily and really showed that there is potential for that Aston Martin team, and especially now with Dan Fallows backing the team. Tell me, what are your thoughts? Did you like the video? If you did, please leave a like, subscribe. It would mean the world, and peace.